good afternoon. I'm Mark Stanislav. I work at Rapid7, if you can tell by the slide template. And so today's talk is about research I did for about 7 or 8 months on 9 different IoT baby monitors. So these are not RF-based. These are not just, waves over the air. These are ones that have Ethernet or Wi-Fi and let you actually talk to them over the internet. So there was a little ambiguity, I think, when I put the title in for GrrCON. It's not generic baby monitors. These are all internet-connected ones. So if you're a fan of CSI Cyber, I personally don't touch the stuff. Not something I can probably stomach to watch. But I was told very quickly after by my PR director, Jen Ellis. She apparently, unfortunately, watched that show and found out that the first episode apparently had something to do with like connected baby monitors and hacking them. And I still have never seen the episode, but that's what I hear. And then Dave Itel, if you follow Dave, the Daily Dave mailing list or anything else like that, you know who Dave is. But he's got some thoughts on junk hacking and what that means and what we're doing in IoT and research right now. But to say the least, CSI Cyber fucked everything up. So, but aside from bad TV shows and angsty people about different research projects, we do have some valuable things to contribute here, right? Which is people buy these things and they're in people's homes and they see you and hear you and when you're having your kid and bring it home for the first day, you probably have a baby monitor. And a lot of these ones on the market now have internet connectivity, whether or not you necessarily wanted it. It's kind of the status quo, the bacon principle of everything's better with bacon, everything's better with Bluetooth and Wi-Fi and Zigbee and Z-Wave and on and on. So, these are real things. The screenshot to the right is actually a message I got from my mother-in-law who was going to purchase literally one of the devices you will see today with the worst vulnerability I found for a baby shower that she was going to. So there's a very practical value here, and the date down there. Every week, 2 weeks, you'll see another story like this somewhere around the world of some jerk on the internet yelling at a kid or yelling at a nanny or whatever. Those are all like well and good and annoying, but there's slightly more risk here than just people getting yelled at on the internet. So what do these devices have? Your typical RF-based ones have actually a lot of features. If you are a parent or have been to maybe a niece or nephew's home with one of your relatives, you've probably seen these devices and they're really fully featured, right? They have full color displays, they have temperature monitoring, humidity monitoring, motion sensors, all this stuff, and these are not even internet connected ones. So the internet connected ones have all those features, plus you can do things like offload the video. So let's say there's a motion alert in the room or a noise alert in the room. It'll actually take a 30-second segment of that, upload it wherever, and then on your smartphone you can look the clip, see like, oh, did my baby wake up because something happened, or did she just wake up for a second, or can I go back to sleep and not actually get up and check on her physically because I'm lazy. So you have features like that. You have features like you can upload music to the baby monitor to play music through it. All kinds of weird, interesting features. It certainly might not be something that every parent needs, but as we know, whether or not you want an internet-connected device, pretty much everything we buy, whether it's a TV or a Blu-ray player, right, these all have internet capabilities these days. It's just kind of the status quo now. The problem here, and I've been doing IoT research for a few years now and see this over and over, so while this talk is certainly on IoT baby monitors, don't for a second think that this doesn't represent consumer IoT in general. These are all different vendors we're going to talk about. These are all different platforms they're built on. This is more of like a case study in terms of what IoT looks like, both consumer and a lot of business applications of IoT as well. There's a lot of overlap there. So we see one big area of failure is the supply chain. We have chipsets that come from random, Taiwanese manufacturers, and they come with firmware that have super outdated software and kernels and libraries that haven't been updated for 5 or 10 years, as we'll see later. And these kinds of devices are not being hardened at the start. And so when the supply chain, you get your components, you put them together as the vendor, you are assuming that your upstreams are taking care of security. You as the vendor are not maybe experts in kernel security. You maybe aren't experts in wireless security. So you're trusting your vendors to do the due diligence for you. And that's a completely flawed model right now because the upstreams are not doing that for components. And so what we end up with is a device with multiple vendors in the supply chain and one big device of a lot of big failures. The other thing is when we have an IoT device, the benefit and the terror of IoT is that there are a lot of components to make it. I don't mean like physical components, I mean like technological components. So short list here being mobile apps, cloud services, backend services like actual like ones on the device itself, web apps, firmware, hardware, network protocols, wireless, and crypto. That's a pretty short list, really. And so the question is, as a vendor, are you going to be an expert in every single last one of those? Not a chance. Even if you go to a third party, like a security firm, are they going to be experts in every single one of those? Probably not a chance. So what happens is maybe you have a really good developer in, Python on your staff, or you have a really good, wireless expert. Well, someone's going to screw up the mobile app. Someone's going to screw up the API. Someone's going to screw up the cloud service integrations or the SDK. So there's going to be an area where you're not proficient at, and you're going to fail. And that's where researchers come in, and we find this terrible stuff. And then overall, IoT, and this is something that's slowly changing, and there's some cool initiatives underway to get there. But overall, like the frameworks, the standards, the protocols for what IoT is using is completely undefined right now. There are some people that are trying to, big companies like Cisco, smaller organizations like Online Trust Alliance, there are efforts underway to give some sanity to what IoT is, but right now it's kind of wild, wild west out there. We don't really have a firm grounding of what IoT should look like, how it should be secured. And anytime you don't have really kind of a playbook to work from, there's going to be a lot of missteps. So kind of briefly, I just want to go over, one of the things in talks like this that I think get lost is the nuance of, well, how do you actually do this research? And I think that's the more interesting part for a lot of you in the room. Maybe you want to get into hardware hacking, maybe you want to get into IoT security research. There are hundreds of thousands of IoT devices, and a lot of them are pretty cheap. So if you want to get into this space, you can go to a Best Buy and buy something off the shelf for $50 and then apply these kinds of techniques and do your own research and, do a talk like this that people hopefully come to. So one really good example, one of the easiest ways to start going after software is to go after the actual firmware. Now firmware, what we think of maybe 20 years ago to today, firmware today is basically just a Linux OS on a, flash. I mean, that's what firmware is to the modern definition. And so there are actually these chips, the small outline integrated circuits, so SOIC for short, I guess. And these chips often are flash packages, and they can be in a variety of size of megabytes, and the overall flash will actually have your entire Linux operating system. It'll have your entire file system, all your good stuff, all your binaries, all your config files. And I've seen other talks where they're like, oh, so all you do is desolder these 8 pins, and you take the chip off and try not to ruin it. You don't have to do any of that. You can get this thing called a Pomona clip, which is just the vendor that makes these clips. They attach directly. You hook it up to a bus pirate or Shikra or something else that can speak SPI. And guess what? You're dumping firmware off in a heartbeat with flash ROM. So this isn't hard. If you can use a screwdriver and open up a case, you can probably hook a clip on and hit flash ROM and a couple parameters, and you've got firmware. Once you have the firmware, a lot of good stuff happens, right? You have all the binaries. You can start reversing it. You have all the config files, all the web apps. You have a lot of good attack surfaces to go from doing that one step. Other means, of course, brute forcing of various ilk. So let's say we get the firmware. There's a shadow file on there with some credentials, assumably for like root and some other unprivileged accounts. Throw it through CUDA hash, octal hashcat stuff, and maybe get some backdoor passwords, because a lot of these devices have hard-coded backdoor passwords. Very common. And then Google, because so many of these things have cloud APIs, guess what? A lot of times you have a random API that you find in reversing a mobile app, or you find an API in a binary. That API host might actually be getting indexed into Google, like some of the screenshot you see up there, where it's actually putting consumer data directly into Google cache. Right? So kind of interesting what you can find if you know what host names you're looking for. And then we have consoles. So UART is pretty much the de facto way you're going to do serial consoles in embedded hardware these days. Wow, that's really fucking hard. And so you can do this a bunch of ways. Anything that speaks, UART, anything that speaks RS-232 type, serial interfaces. JTagulator, which people only use for JTAG enumeration, actually has a whole UART enumeration as well, and then you can talk UART over it, which is cool. The cool thing about having this is you have an embedded device that has no VGA port. It has no, USB port for keyboards, right? Embedded hardware. What this effectively gives you is it gives you a mouse, or it gives you a keyboard and a monitor on embedded hardware, effectively. I mean, that's what a serial console basically gives you. So you sometimes get lucky and there's no credentials whatsoever. You just get dropped to a root shell. Other times you have a credential, but then you can go to like U-boot, which is the bootloader you'll see very often. And that bootloader, you can just hit 1 into the boot args, and guess what? You dropped to single user mode. Now you're root. Now you can change the password and log in and do everything the way you want it to do it. So a lot of cool things you can do once you have serial console access. If you want to get more involved and you don't have, maybe you don't have the luxury of having a manipulate case with the kernel arguments, which does happen. Sometimes they hard code the kernel arguments and don't let you kind of manipulate those. You can use JTAG, and JTAG basically is speaking at the lowest level of hardware communication you'll probably ever get through some sort of interface like this. And what's cool about JTAG, it really doesn't limit you in what you can do. It's a little finicky in how you do it, but it really doesn't limit you in what you can do. So a couple of good examples of what you can do with JTAG. One is, and I've done this before on this device that's not a baby monitor, but useful for this screenshot anyways, is you can dump live memory. So you can hook up GDB, dump live memory, and so all the stuff in memory, maybe it's session keys, maybe it's credentials, maybe it's API endpoints, you can dump all this through JTAG. And so even if you can't log into the device, you are taking live memory out of it. The other thing you can do is manipulate memory. So let's say you actually kill execution of this device as it's booting up the kernel. You can actually manipulate the bytes of memory to overwrite those hard-coded kernel parameters and actually still single user mode the device, even if it was supposed to not let you. Ton of power, not the easiest thing to work with, but sometimes you can get lucky with what you need to do. Mobile applications are the best thing out there right now for any kind of IoT, kind of like reversing and security, because everyone makes terrible mobile apps. Like everyone just makes terrible mobile apps. Whether it's you hard code the URLs to firmware, which skips that whole like dumping flash thing. You see a bunch of API calls that very often don't do certificate pinning, so you man in the middle of the SSL traffic, or half the time, honestly, it's just clear text traffic already. Decrypt binaries with something like Clutch for iOS. Use Jeb or Dextojar and go to town on Android. There's a lot of easy ways, and so many interesting things, some of which we'll talk about are in those. Basic network analysis, Wireshark, Nmap, no surprise there. Web apps, you've got both the back-end web apps for the actual hardware, and you also have a lot of cloud services. So like the first screenshot is a cross-site scripting on the website that logs you in to the cloud service to talk to the camera, right? So anything you can think about with cross-site scripting, hijacking sessions, screwing with the DOM, whatever you want to do. Sometimes you'll get lucky and steal session cookies and whatever. And the back-end web stuff is pretty obvious. So that's some of the techniques. That's not certainly an exhaustive list, but hopefully if you've been thinking about getting into this kind of space, those are some great techniques to look into, and most of the hardware and software is either cheap or free, so go crazy. So the baby monitors themselves, just to give you a sense, these are 9 different cameras across 8 vendors, and the price points range from $60 or $55 to $260. So a lot of vendors, a lot of price points, different feature sets. I really wanted to have, like I said, a case study. I don't want to just be like, oh, what are like the lowest common denominator cameras on the market? How secure are they? I wanted to see like kind of a range of vendors and price points. So this talk, there's actually a whole white paper. We've done webinars on this research. So there's actually more content than what I'll get to today. What I kind of want to point out today is a broad view of the kinds of things you find when you do IoT security research. So some of these are not bugs. Some of these are just like funny shit that I thought was interesting for a talk. Other things are bugs, and are bugs but not really vulnerabilities, if you want to draw that line. And then there are definitely vulnerabilities that we'll get to. And we kind of ramp up from like funny to like, oh crap, really quickly. So we'll get there. Hang in there if you're getting tired. First one, WeThings, which popular brand WeThings. They have a ton of IoT devices. This camera, which I think was definitely on the higher end of the price points. One really important thing with IoT is they aren't consumer electronics. They don't have human interfaces on the devices natively. So guess what we use? We almost always use a mobile app. The mobile app is our lifeline for controlling these devices other than unplugging the device. And so this is a camera where it has a feature specifically that says baby monitoring is disabled. The screen goes blank on your mobile app. It says it's disabled. Well, guess what? If you've man in the middle of the traffic, you found the RTMP stream that's live, that RTMP stream is still live after you disable the camera. It's still streaming video. You can still watch video real time. So if you as a parent or whatever, you're like, hey, whatever's about to happen, choose your own adventure on that one. We're going to turn this camera off for, a half hour. Well, guess what? If someone's on your network, they're still watching the stream with you. You think you've disabled it, you have not. So a good example of a bug, vulnerability, you can, juggle that one yourself. But certainly a bug and something that shouldn't happen, and people trust the mobile app to tell them what's happening. This is an example where that trust failed. This one's a little bit confusing, so I'll try to step through it as best I can. So we've got we did dextrajar. We have some Java that represents the mobile app for this device. We look through it. We find this method called MD5 root session, which sounds super sexy and fun. So we start looking at it, and we see this method called mchunk. And I'm not a huge Java developer, but I've never heard of mchunk before. I was like, I don't know what this is. Let me look through the code base. And sure enough, there's a method that's defined called mchunk. And so what it does is basically there's this MD5 hash that's going to get created. The first part is an email address for the the company. The next part is like the string, and then there's a parameter string at the very end. So if you look at the top screenshot towards the right side of it, you're going to see like mchunk 99, mchunk 60,000, mchunk whatever. So what this is doing, if you look at the second screenshot, is there's this like for loop, and it's going to take that number and do some math and like subtract and subtract and subtract and do this math. And basically all it's going to do is obfuscate that password, or that the core part of the password that is now becoming that MD5 string, right? It's an obfuscation routine to hide this stuff in the code. Well, fun fact, there's actually a return statement at the top of the for loop. So all the obfuscation stuff you see at the very bottom is not even being hit. So we have this obfuscation routine that's not actually obfuscating anything. And now whether that was a final decision by the developer, whether it was like, oh crap, I forgot to like take the return statement out during debug, we don't know why it happened, but what we do know is that clearly the developer was going to obfuscate it and then didn't for one of many reasons. And this is the kind of stuff that you will only see by like going through mobile apps or going through binaries, stepping through them, looking at the best effort decompilation, and looking through these things and actually understanding what might have happened there and why. Wi-Fi Baby, the highest priced camera, one of the worst cameras in terms of like usage and quality and everything else. But a couple weird things, and again, not bugs necessarily, but just really things that shouldn't happen. Good example of information disclosure. Every single HTTP endpoint of this camera has authentication, except for a log file. And this camera actually is one camera that actually does UPnP. So it's actually going to expose itself over the internet with a dying DNS address. So this is going to be on the internet. And when we have things like log files, and these log files, guess what, get indexed into Google sometimes, and then we see things like RTMP endpoints. Who knows what kind of debug info? Will it dump credentials? Will it dump internal and external IP addresses? We don't know what's going to happen. And this is a good example where they spend a lot of time protecting the web server, except for the thing that gives a ton of detail and info about the web server that might be useful to an attacker on the outside. Another example, and this is a very common theme that we'll see through other kind of examples, there was an SSL cert on this device. The SSL cert was hard-coded, the private key was hard-coded. This is not something that gets generated when the device boots up. It's not unique. But even though it supports SSL and has SSL, even as bad implementation, this device doesn't use SSL. Everything you do with this device is clear text. And this is a 2015 camera. Literally, the model number has 2015 in it. So if we're all like, oh yeah, SSL and TLS, oh yeah, we should be doing like SSL or TLS 1.2 now, and get rid of SSL 3. These cameras do not even talk SSL, let alone like a good version of TLS anymore, right? So we have devices, 2015, $260 baby monitors that don't even encrypt data. This is the state of IoT affairs right now. As a better example of another point of $260 cameras and IoT and baby monitor, UPnP remote code execution bugs from 2012. CVSS10, like go into Metasploit right now, you'll find targets for these bugs. These bugs in a brand new device, off the shelf 2015 model, still have CVSS10 remote code execution bugs from 2012, right? So when you think about like, oh, like how bad could these devices really be? Like, oh, they probably have some bugs. This has like a direct, you own the camera bug. And again, this camera sits on the internet UPnP. You have direct, you literally direct connect, drop some fancy assembly, and guess what? You're on that camera now and doing code execution. Lens peak of view, this camera's a piece of shit. You can tell because it looks like a piece of shit. At $60, that's another good indicator. Funny thing that I found, when I was doing packet captures like I do for all these devices, I saw FTP data. I was like, oh, FTP data, that's weird. Like, was it grabbing like firmware or like some random thing they shouldn't be doing anyways over FTP? It turns out every single camera is given FTP credentials that are unique to that camera. And there's this email configuration file that gets uploaded that's completely blank. And I didn't even see a way to add data to this, like through the user interface, right, to actually use. So you basically have free cloud storage, right? You have an FTP server owned with your own credentials on this camera, and you can just upload stuff as you want. So if you want to, run a Where server or whatever you need to do, plenty of free storage. Backdoor credentials, we'll see this as a common theme. I don't talk about every credential we found, but some examples. Web app config. Good news is the admin default login, you can actually change that one. Bad news is you cannot change the user or guest login. And of course the user login lets you view the camera. It's all over clear text anyways, so you can steal credentials even if you didn't know them before if you're packet sniffing. Kind of all hope is lost. There was a default admin password. In this example, the admin password is actually a root password because of the file system configuration. Again, hard-coded root password, 6 characters, alphanumeric, no big deal to crack. Again, we'll see more of that kind of thing. Gioni, this is just a great example of how badly we're not encrypting. So these are 4 different screenshots for 4 different interfaces of this one camera. We have 2 cloud providers and 2 local web application servers. None of them are encrypted. All of it's clear text, all the registration for your account, all the credentials, everything is clear text over the wire, whether it's internet facing or local LAN. So if you were kind of on the fence on whether or not stuff's encrypted, it's not. TrendNet, so TrendNet had a couple of things. This one's actually still redacted because as far as I'm aware, they haven't fixed this, and we kind of gave them a push on this one. But TrendNet actually had a cross-site scripting vulnerability in the authentication area for this actual camera where you can log in and actually view the camera on a web service versus like a mobile app. Aside from the fact it's all clear text to begin with, you have cross-site scripting. You can, click jack. You can, take your DOM-based attack and go wild. So not a great thing to see. Really good phishing campaign opportunity, right? Good news is this camera used to have Telnet enabled by default. Does not have Telnet enabled by default. The problem is it still has Telnet. And one of the things that when I talk to vendors, whether it's like as research or I work with IoT vendors like professionally for work as well, and I'm like, hey, if you don't need that binary, if you don't need that service, you should get it off the file system, right? Because if I can find a script or a bug or code execution or something, I can go from having like some weird PHP, like localized PHP thing sandboxed and be like, oh, guess what? Like telnet d ampersand, and now I'm running telnet again. So you should try to restrict it. It's not going to solve all your problems, but you shouldn't make it easier on the attacker than it already is, which is pretty easy. Still, the interesting thing is they disabled telnet, but they still left a username root password admin, right, on the camera. So you can do this via UART if you want to do physical access type stuff, which is boring in my opinion. But the more important part is, again, if you can enable telnet, you now have hard-coded default credentials to log in as root on telnet. So it kind of cascades the vulnerabilities and concerns. iBaby M3S, this is one of 2 iBaby cameras we'll talk about. So we see very quickly through just an Nmap scan, port 23 is open. We're like, okay, cool, telnet, and you don't even need to try to dump the firmware. If you're going to guess passwords right, you're going to do like root admin 123, right? So during this research, of course, I did that, and I log in as admin on telnet, and I'm effectively, again, root on this device because there's only one account called admin. There's no root account. But once I get on there, I start looking around, and the first thing I see is I look at the Etsy password file. Not Etsy shadow, Etsy password. One indicator that something's about to go wrong. Indicator number 2 that something's about to go wrong is if you look at the actual hash at the bottom there after the admin colon, that's the actual hash. That is very clearly based on the size, and there's no like leading salt or anything. It's very clearly descrypt. Descrypt has been like gone, or should have been gone for like 15 years now at the very least. So two really quick indicators: Telnet enabled, well, Etsy password, and then Descrypt. So if you look a little closer, you've got U-boot from 2005, OpenSSL from 2007, which is so old it's not even affected by Heartbleed. So that's kind of actually a benefit of security. It has a Linux kernel from 2007, which God only knows how many local root exploits there are. Yeah, just pick a number that above like 100, and you'll probably be correct. BusyBox from 08, and of course using Telnet and Unix crypt. Again, this is the most current software for one of the most popular baby monitors on being sold today, and it's running software from 2005, and it costs $200. So one of the questions that I was asked a lot during press things about this stuff and some other talks was, oh, did you see a relationship between cost and security? The answer is absolutely not. The highest end camera and the lowest end camera, they all sucked, as you will come to find out sooner than later. Encryption, this was the only camera I believe that did that for all video transmission, video audio transmission. And there are different ways. You can have live video, you can have video at rest, like recorded clips, right? So this was the only device that actually encrypted all the video and audio over the wire. Two things. One is it used XXT, which unless you've done Xbox hacking back in the day, you probably have no idea what XXT is as a cipher. This is not something that you probably dealt with or heard of. Maybe you're a crypto expert, maybe you have, but most people haven't. So kind of a weird choice, not necessarily the worst thing in the world to use, but also not a great choice. At the very top, and this is another good example where going through the mobile app and looking at code and trying to understand binaries is good. We see that there's a backup function on this camera, and then when we look through some of the methods, it calls this, just kind of stock AES-256 encryption thing, which is, okay, cool, you're using AES-256, good for you. But it hard codes the passphrase for the AE-256, or AES-256. It also uses ECB mode, which is, again, a crypto thing that only a few of you care about. But overall, it's one of those things, if you ever find a config dump, they get indexed on Google, someone leaks data, there's a bug that lets you export an encrypted backup, take your pick. This one passphrase will unlock all the credentials, all the config details, everything. All right, this is where we start ramping up some of the really, really bad stuff. Drink a beer. So iBaby M6, again, iBaby. A couple another few examples of terrible no crypto. So they have this web interface, which we'll talk about more in a second. No crypto for login, whatever else for administration. All the API calls for the mobile app, completely unencrypted, and also running Telnet with default credentials. So are you getting a recurring theme yet on some of this stuff? Why this website's important is if you look at the left side and the right side, like you see there's very clearly a problem. That used to not happen. So that error output, that exception handler for not being able to call like a hashing function or whatever it says up there, that used to not happen. And before that happened, we had this. So very subtle detail that there's no way you can probably see on this screen because the resolution's terrible. The top one where it says proper account is mark.stanislav@gmail.com. The attacker account is mark.stanislav, no dot, no period in the middle, @gmail.com. If you're familiar with how a lot of email handling works, the actual period for Gmail doesn't matter. It's the same account. You can't register two different accounts for it. So what's really easy, and you can do like +1 or +foo or +bar and it'll do the same thing. But for testing purposes, these accounts are completely different, right? When you sign up with an email address, that's a complete unique identifier for that account. So I signed up for two accounts. One account's attached to the camera, the other account's for testing, okay? In the background and the foreground, you can see the same screen. Why that's a problem is because only the proper account is attached to the camera, the attacker account is not attached to the camera. And in the parlance of our industry, we call this a direct object reference, where you basically put in the object ID and it doesn't actually do authorization check for the object ID that you're looking at. This is like the Weave case, right, with AT&T data. So I go to the serial number of this device, which is the literal serial number, that 4106 AECV or whatever it says. Very small key space, obviously, and it's, again, a serial number, so you can kind of guess how that number is created. And so once you're in there, you're like, okay, there's some basic info, like some of that stuff might be interesting, whatever data. But there's this tab called alert information. And alert information is kind of interesting because I went here, I was like, oh, weird, like there's all these broken screenshots. Maybe the site doesn't work anymore, maybe it's broken or whatever. Well, I looked again and I was like, actually those are those are alerts I made. Like I remember those timestamps and I remember testing the camera and I know those are actual alerts. Like, so whatever the screenshot's doing is not really relevant. So when you look at the HTML, you look and the screenshot of course is linked and the link is an AVI file name. Well, you get the AVI file name, you man in the middle the mobile traffic, and the mobile traffic has, God, this is terrible looking. You have mobile traffic that has an Amazon S3 bucket. The Amazon S3 bucket is one bucket for all accounts. It has the actual serial number in the actual URL. So you change the serial number, you go to the web page, you change the serial number, you enumerate every single video for every single camera, you append it to this bucket with the serial number in place for the right one, and you can literally steal every single alert video from every camera ever created. So every time there's a motion in the room, every time there's a sound in the room, and it records a 30-second default clip that you may or may not look at, you may or may not ever delete, they might just happen, you never know they actually are even happening. This data is all for the taking with one direct object reference vulnerability. So, as you can imagine, that's kind of a big deal because while maybe you like snoop on a camera and maybe someone's in the room or maybe someone's talking, these video clips are literally guaranteeing you for some sort of activity, right? They can only be recorded because of a loud noise or because of motion. So you're pretty much guaranteed as an attacker to get like a treasure trove of people's personal lives. Kind of a big deal. Also, none of these URLs are signed with S3 buckets can be signed and should be signed. None of the data it's actually downloading through your mobile apps even encrypted. Like there's no HTTPS being used at all, and the video clips are not encrypted when they're uploaded. So as soon as you know the URL, you can go to the URL, no authentication, no signature, no token, just hit the URL, download the video clip, clear text, done. And again, every single customer. And this camera is the #1 selling IoT camera on Amazon. Fun fact. A couple other weird things, again, fun things for different strokes, different folks. The one being there's a hidden wiki for this service for some reason with a password that I'm sure is super just awesome and secure and could never be phished. And then there's an entire admin backend for this service. So again, go to haveibeenpwned.com, right, and hopefully maybe get an employee's password. These are not things that should be exposed to the public internet, right? Like these should be somewhere on your like controlled internal network. This should not be an interface I can just hit on the website and brute force or again steal credentials and log into. So this example, this camera, we've got stealing all data from every camera that's ever been recorded. We move along to the Philips Insight camera, which I should say Philips was an amazing company to work with for disclosure. We don't get to say that a lot in the security industry, so a lot of props to them and the team. Fun fact, again, I did research in 2013 on a camera called the Eyes-On. I might have gave that talk here a few years back. And so the Eyes-On, like I did a bunch of research and found all this bad shit and whatever. So when I started looking at this Insight camera, guess what? The firmware is the same firmware, the hardware is the same hardware. It's basically white labeled guts in a different shell. So I was like, oh, cool, like maybe the stuff I reported got fixed upstream and now all these, vendors using this stuff will also have these fixes downstream. That's the hope, right? Well, that didn't happen. So like I found out in 2013, this camera has no SSL on the web services. There, I think, are 3 hard-coded Unix accounts by default just because of the vendor of the firmware. Like it's their stock firmware hard-coded credentials. The entire firmware upgrade process is insecure. It's like very adorable that there's an MD5 sum because some people might go like, oh, there's an MD5 sum. You're going to check the integrity and make sure no one like maliciously edited the firmware. Well, they're both coming over clear text. So I can manipulate your MD5 sum the same way I can manipulate your firmware, and guess what? They'll still match up correctly. And then we have Telnet enabled by default. That was a recent change they disabled, luckily, so that's good news. When I bought the camera, it wasn't that way. After a while, they updated and disabled it. So where this gets more interesting, and again, a common theme we'll see on a lot of IoT devices today, default root password of B120 root. The model number of this camera is B120. Their username is root. B120 root is the password. There is an admin password. Now, this is one thing that changed versus the Eyes-On camera I did research on. The Eyes-On camera used to have a hard-coded admin credential for the web app that would talk over and actually do like kind of API call security. So what they did, and maybe what these guys also kind of followed suit on, was they actually decided that they would do something really super secure and take the MAC address of the device, make an MD5 string of it, truncate it to 10 characters, and that is now your secure token. Because, of course, MAC addresses are private on the network and no one can look at ARP cache and figure out what your MAC address is. So again, it's one of those things like if you know a camera's on the network or you look up the OUI of the manufacturer and you're like, oh, that's one of those cameras, you can actually make your own admin password for that camera and have your own backdoor admin account. When we're talking about, and kind of a foreshadowing to what I was talking about earlier, where you should like get rid of services you don't need, get rid of binaries you don't need, they disabled Telnet, yes. But what they did is they created this thing called cam_service_enable.cgi that all it does is start Telnet. So you combine the known password creation with a known URL to enable Telnet with a hard-coded backdoor root password, and guess what we have? We have remote shell on Telnet now again. So they disabled some like insecure process, they fixed an insecure hard-coded password, and completely still shot themselves in the foot. So we're back to square one. The one in the bottom corner is actually really interesting, and this gets back to the supply chain problem. Well, a lot of this is all supply chain problem, by the way, but Weaved is actually a third-party cloud service that provides cloud services for IoT vendors. They work with a bunch of platform providers and a lot of vendors, and so they were providing the interface to which they were doing like live streaming. Like that was the functionality Weaved was like supporting. Well, Weaved, when I was going through it, I was kind of like looking around and just like dorking around on some stuff, and I found like some cross-site scripting, and I'm not a person that really gets super excited about cross-site scripting. I find it super boring and generic and not really interesting. However, the one thing I noticed a little bit after I actually found the bugs I found was I was going through this stuff so quick, because when you're researching 9 devices at one time between work and life and everything else, that's a lot of stuff to look at, right? And so I kind of just skipped. I was like, oh, cool, cross-site scripting, I'll like note it and come back to it later. Well, I came back to it later and didn't realize I'd actually found stored cross-site scripting, which is slightly more interesting than reflective, because the same back-end interface to which the admins of the service are going to view this database data in their console, like administratively, is of course the same front-end, views and stuff, just like different authorization levels and permissions. So I can change the device ID of this camera, make a name where I do cross-site scripting, and they didn't use HTTP only, which if you're not super privy on this kind of stuff, HTTP only basically prevents JavaScript from actually looking at session data effectively on a specific cookie that you set that Boolean for. So what that does is prevent from me stealing your session cookie, putting it into my own browser, and now I'm your session on my browser. Well, if I can do cross-site scripting that's stored and it affects a back-end admin interface, guess whose session cookie I'm stealing? I'm stealing the admin of the entire platform, right? So this isn't just this camera that I own. It's not just this vendor using this camera. This is every single cloud-providing IoT vendor using Weaved. I can steal session and actually log in as that admin for the entire platform. So a very simple bug that I was like going to throw away and not even talk about today, I just happened to take another look and realize what I had found, and guess what? It was a complete platform takeover for an IoT vendor. Where this gets bad for Philips specifically, not Weaved, is there's a lot of different models of connectivity right now with IoT, and this is a very common one where you basically have a reverse proxy. So we have a camera behind a home network. The home network talks, to the internet talks to the mobile device. The question is, how do you talk to the camera behind your home network? You can do port forwarding, not so common anymore. You can do UPnP, getting less common. You can do reverse proxies like this. So what happens is there's an agent that talks on the camera out to a cloud service on the internet. It actually takes your web interface on this camera's back end and puts it on a public host name and a public port on the internet. So this camera behind your home network is no longer behind your home network. It's on the internet publicly facing. Where this falls apart is there's a lot of ways to do this okay. Like you can do, not great ways, but there are ways to do it, like IP whitelisting. Who was the source of this original transaction? A token, where you authenticate every transaction and make sure there's a valid token. Granted, this is all clear text, so there's a whole another set of problems here. But what happens is this proxy is the entire backend web interface, and there's a bug in how they deployed this where there is no authentication. If you can find this camera's port and host name on the internet, which is enumerable, of course, You can literally talk to the entire backend camera without credentials, without authentication, without a token, without an IP address source, anything. If you find the camera, you're talking directly to the backend web interface, which, if you forgot already, we have a known CGI script that we can hit enter on, or throw in our browser, hit enter, and we enable telnet remotely over the internet, which my friends at Rapid7 were so kind to test for me. This is a problem because there are a finite number of host names they use for these proxy addresses, and there's a finite number of port numbers. And as you probably know, scanning the internet is very, very fast. So you can literally just scan these ports over and over and over for all these host names, wait until you get a 200 response, and you have a live camera on the internet that you can pull up in VLC immediately with a URL that is not authenticated, and start live streaming that camera, or enable telnet, or have a remote code execution bug and actually throw malware on there. Take your pick of bad scenario, but we have a camera on the internet without any authentication. That's kind of the TLDR on that. You can also do fun things. So as you probably hopefully saw with Chris Valasek and Charlie Miller's Jeep research, they had put their tracksuit photo on the display on that. And I'm personally of the thought and mindset that instead of like calc.exe for like a Windows application like POC, we should use Charlie and Chris in tracksuits as visualization POCs. So you can take over the stream that people are seeing on their mobile device. And we saw these bad TV shows like, oh, wouldn't it be funny if you could like take 5 seconds of video and loop it so you can break in and then like steal stuff and leave, and then it goes back to live video. Like, we've seen that plot a million times. You can totally do that in IoT. This is a real life thing. I can put Charlie and Chris on a video stream forever if you want. There's a lot of cool things you can do when you have control over their camera, right? And so we went from recorded videos, full access to all recorded videos, to kind of opportunistic binary execution and video streaming and all kinds of weird stuff. The Summer Infant, very popular camera, very popular brand for babies. I don't have time for this right now, unfortunately, but Amir over at Optiv did some really awesome research on this as well that we're not going to talk about things that he found last year, but new stuff I found this year. One of which is a very subtle detail, right, which is how do you do password security the right way, and how do you do password resets and create accounts? Well, this is not the way to do it. I think you'll be able to find out. So by default, when you create an account, or they create an account for you, I should say, it uses your last name truncated to 8 characters, and then a group ID, which is kind of the serial number integer for your account. So let's happenstance say that someone in your family bought one of these cameras, or someone bought one of these cameras. Well, you know their last name. We have an integer to start with. You go before it, you go after it, and you're probably going to find their default password to the account. Because let's face it, how many people are going to change a default password, let alone one that looks secure? Like on the surface, like someone would see that, like your family, my parents would see that password and be like, that's a great password. It's got a capital letter, it's long, it's got numbers. I'm not going to change it. I'm just going to use it. No big deal. So you can enumerate and actually log in with credentials, because guess what? People aren't going to change them. So this screenshot is the most unexciting screenshot you will ever see, certainly today, but it's kind of important. And the reason why it's important in the text you can't see down there is that on the first screen there's this backend web interface for this camera, right? You log in, you can administrate things, and you can actually give privilege to people. You can actually say, hey, user at email address whatever.com, I want to give you permission to watch my baby because you're my brother, you're my sister-in-law. Check out your niece or nephew, whatever, from your own phone. So you give them account access, and you let them see the camera and use it. Cool, sounds good. The problem is, and what you can't see down there is there's a very simple curl command. And the curl command has a first name, it's got a last name, it's got an email address, and it's got this group ID serial number thing, right? The thing it doesn't have is authentication. It doesn't require basic authentication, it doesn't require a token, it doesn't require OAuth, it doesn't require password, it requires no authentication. So guess what that means? If you start at a really low number and go to a really high number and you run a for loop, you can create accounts on every single person's camera out there. And then just open your mobile app, log in as them, and you're watching the video stream live of that camera. And you can even control the camera too, because that's a good feature to have for an attacker. So again, very unsexy thing, very boring bug, because guess what? IoT security is not good. It's very bad. All the bugs you've seen today, all the issues you've seen today, I guarantee 90% of you are like, oh, that's not even a good bug. I agree with you. They're terrible bugs. But guess what? I'm taking over thousands of cameras at one time on the internet. That's good bugs or bad bugs. That's a useful thing for an attacker. And when we see like one-off stories about like, oh, so-and-so broke into one camera and like yelled at a nanny. Cool, they broke into one camera. We've literally taken data and camera access over for tens of thousands of devices from 3 different vendors with crappy web bugs. So, and IoT platform takeovers on top of that, right? So disclosure stuff. July 4th is kind of a weird date because we had to fit it in for a talk that I was giving. So we dropped the July 4th USA disclosure date on everyone. We work with CERT for every bug that we pass along, and we always do a 60-day disclosure window for all the vendors that we talk to. So we try to give people a good time to get back to us and work with us and fix bugs and kind of all the good, feel-good, like full disclosure stuff not being in there. We do coordinated disclosure with all these vendors. And so kind of a checklist, and this is kind of a quick wrap-up just to kind of give a visualization of where we're at. So again, we didn't talk about every bug we found, we didn't talk about every issue that we saw, but kind of the high-level view, right? If it has an X, that's bad. And there's a lot of X's up there, right? So things like local APIs or cloud APIs using actual SSL TLS, not having remote shells like Telnet and SSH, not having hidden accounts, which you see every single camera had at least one hidden account that you as a consumer doesn't know is there. Every single camera. Known vulnerabilities, we're not even talking about like boring vulnerabilities. We're talking about like vulnerabilities that actually do bad things. UART access, every single one had UART serial console, and then encryption, again, one of the 9 actually had all of it encrypted. So I made up like this really weird scoring rubric that tries to do apples to apples badness and tries to give you a sense of how good or bad these cameras are. So you take away points for all these things. All the cameras start with the same amount of points. You take away points for bad things. And that's where we get left. We get left with every camera but one got an F. If we take that point scale and associate with like a grade scale like we're used to. The one that got a D, like it just got past an F, right? Like it was almost an accident, I think, on their part. But overall, I think the takeaway, if you couldn't tell from the rest of this talk, IoT security is terrible. Consumer security for IoT is terrible. It doesn't matter if you spend $55 or $260. It's terrible. And again, these are baby monitors. They're completely made to invade your privacy, and they have terrible security. And whether or not you think it's a baby monitor or a smart TV or router, we see these common themes all the time. There's a lot of research yet to be done, and a lot of products every day coming to the market, and no one's looking at. So overall, like, yeah, there are some bugs. There are some things that would bother me. I'm actually expecting a kid, and I can tell you I won't be using any of these cameras, even though I have an entire drawer full of free devices. I won't be using any of them. So that kind of gives you an indicator of how I feel about overall security. Most of these things have bugs that I didn't even take time to care about. Like, we hear about like, CSRF, right? Okay. Every single one of these cameras, in some way, shape, or form, has a CSRF bug. I'm not even going to go through and write up all the CVEs because I would go like gray before that happened. There are so many bugs that it's not even worth getting into. It's worth getting into critical bugs, I think, but there are so many issues with these pieces of software for a variety of reasons. But just know that if you want to get into the space, you are going to find bugs. If you want to get into offensive security research, you will find bugs in IoT devices. So if you want like that first like rah-rah, like I totally hacked something, go get an IoT device. You will be an awesome hacker tomorrow. Overall, everything's terrible. Line 2, everything's terrible. Line 3 is people are unaware everything's terrible. Line 4 is realistically, like, Philips has a good security program. A lot of this stuff, again, is supply chain problems. This is going to be a recurring thing you hear in the news if you don't already about IoT. Most things are a supply chain problem. There are some good initiatives. So Zach Lanier, who's over there, and I started Build Securely a couple years ago to work with IoT vendors to actually make IoT suck less. We've done pretty good in some ways. Done a lot of knowledge transfer, have a lot of cool partners in IoT, and making some waves there, which is good. OWASP, which a lot of you are probably familiar with, OWASP has more than just the web top 10 if you weren't aware. They have a lot of other top 10 lists and other research that they do and guidance, one of which is an IoT top 10. The Online Trust Alliance is currently in the second round of drafting an IoT trust framework, which effectively gives you both information security and privacy controls that you should aspire to have. So if you're an IoT vendor, it's kind of a good like scoring rubric in its own right to say, oh, I do provide retention of data policies. I do encrypt data. I do X, Y, and Z. So it's at least a starting point for vendors to actually know what they should be doing, because as we've seen today, there's not really a good sense of what people should be doing that would make it secure. And then Google has some projects that have come out recently. Brillo is basically a hardened, stripped down Android version that is made for IoT devices, and they're starting to use it in their own products, like the OnHub that just came out a while ago. And maybe the Nest Cam as well, I'm not sure. And then there's also Weave, which is a secure communication protocol between devices. So one of the biggest problems we have, getting back to supply chain, is we have bad firmware. And a lot of bad firmware could be resolved if we had a good provider of firmware. Google's trying to solve that problem for a lot of people. Give good firmware that has basic hardening done, and now we don't have all these bugs I talked about for a lot of the cases. And I don't know where Nick got this shirt. This is Nick Percoco, if you don't know Nick. Go to ThoughtCon coming up. But Nick got this crazy shirt and made him take a picture for this talk. But basically, like, yeah, I mean, whether it's screaming at babies or blowing up like ovens or whatever the crazy IoT scenario you want to talk about today is, there's a lot of research. Like I said, go buy stuff, go break stuff. You'll have a lot of fun, learn a lot of techniques, and do some cool stuff. But I would hope, at least those of you that give a shit, that you would say like, oh yeah, protecting like families' privacy and babies and stuff is cool. Like I was pretty happy to do this research. I think there's a lot of benefit to to consumers that don't know otherwise and can't protect themselves. So there's a lot of there's a lot of problems, and there's a lot of areas that you can help. So go try to make a difference in that regard. I think I'm a couple minutes over time. Any like one or two quick questions that I can answer? Yeah. Yeah. So the question basically is, I looked at cameras that sucked. Are there cameras that don't suck? So I'm of the mindset that honestly, if you don't need some of the internet connected features of a baby monitor, you should just get an RF monitor. Are RF based monitors still susceptible to attacks? Absolutely, right? However, are you susceptible to attacks across the entire internet? No, you're susceptible from like the weird down the street from you that has the knowledge to do like software defined radio stuff. So that's a really mitigated attack surface versus the entire internet, right? So that's my personal opinion. I do have I have a drop cam that I have in my house that I love. I'm kind of worried about some of the new things I've seen with the Nest version of the drop cam, but overall, pretty solid camera, good security team over there. Overall, the less features you need, the better. Buy the camera with the least features, because the more features mean more attack surface, right? It's the same principle that we do with everything in security. Any other quick question? Oh, Dave, you look amazing. Are you? I think that was my last question. Thanks, Dave. So thank you very much for coming. I hope you have a great time at GrrCON.